This podgy, maimed, and downhearted face is none other than your society's Winston Smith. Yes, I lived a similar reality to that of the protagonist from George Orwell's 1984, and I'm here to tell you about it. The loss of life on the surface is only a hint of the internal, spiritual, and interpersonal loss. How and why your tax dollars define me as a terrorist is ludicrous. But the moral justification and simplicity of my destruction is even more frightening and insane. I survived being entrapped with the shadow government. I use the word survive because I could have easily perished. The dark intentions behind the men and women who denied my liberty for their possible prosperity knew no bounds of terror. In the end, I never gave these tyrannical sadists any illusion of superiority over me. They tried, even though I was entirely broken and helpless. They couldn't boast their spineless nature over my demise. I didn't let them obtain that insecure satisfaction within them, the void where their soul ought to be. I made sure I wouldn't be a trophy on their coffee table. The story I'm going to tell you involves a girl, a public education system, a politician, a fixed election, opportunists in the FBI and local law enforcement, and an environment based on greed and recklessness with no respect to life or truth. These personalities, along with me, will remain anonymous for the time being. But these phases of evil, deceit, and victimhood are no strangers to history or literature. It's ultimately a story about a new minority. The white, middle-class, heterosexual Christian male has no place in this newly engineered society by self-gratifying utopians. If you fit the criteria of being motivated, ambitious, caring, intelligent, independent, or romantic, or wish to leave the world a better place than you found it in, well, your future might look as dark as mine. The story will have many themes that run parallel to dystopian literature like 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. I am that human pulse that connects us to these nightmares. Let me put in a word about this video and why I'm communicating through this medium. There are people within the media who pose as journalists. The sad truth that most are only public relations officers who print press releases. Even more obscure is to find an investigative journalist. Stunted and downsized by management in the aim of saving money over providing a much-needed service. I have emailed dozens of people within the media. Hours have been wasted, and there has been little to nothing to show for it. The story you're about to hear is very dark. Very few people want to attach their names to it. I do apologize if the audio quality on this video is low to mediocre. The camera I'm using doesn't support an external microphone, but I'll try to project my voice. This production is a one-man show. I'm choosing efficiency and simplicity over glamour. Apart from this introduction, the video will be cut into 6 parts. I'll focus on facts over speculation, but I won't be a slave to the detail. I'll broaden the story as time elapses, to give a viewer a dose of the sheer insanity that engulfed my life. The story begins at a public university. I lived a little less than a mile from it with my family. In the spring of 2012, I started my first semester there studying computer science. There was a girl I shared 2 classes with. Each day, we would meet for at least an hour. Although she would always hint communication with me, I would ignore her. As the semester was ending, I submitted to the desire of knowing each other. Knowing each other meant something different for her. What she wanted was a cliché, but I wanted something authentic. We were both under the influence of love at different times, but this relationship will be discussed more closely later. From May to July of 2012, I was under the impression that I was emailing her. Roughly 4 days after the termination of these emails with her, a police officer came to my home. He left me with a threat. Do note there was no physical interaction between me and her during that time period. The relationship was restricted to emails apart from a few odd appearances. My scene with a cop was something like this. My father came home from work in the afternoon. As he got home, he ordered me to move my car from the driveway onto the street. I went into my car. I turned it on and opened the windows to expel the accumulated summer heat. And I went inside my home for a minute or 2 while the car idled. As I came back to my car, I noticed a police car from a foreign town parked alongside my home on the street. The town painted on the car was some 10 miles away from me, 15 to 30 minutes in driving time, and that girl was the only person anyone in my household knew from there. I proceeded to back my car until a cop came to my vehicle on the street. He said that the girl wanted to let me know as a joke. I simply waved at him that I had to move my car and I would talk to him later. My father asked him what the problem is. I'm his son and he wants to know what's going on. The cop only repeated that he needed to talk to me, and he wouldn't tell him why he was visiting me. We met at the end of the driveway. I told him I didn't want my father over here, and we both relocated near his car, which was idling during our entire conversation. The conversation lasted some 10 to 20 minutes in total. I noticed the physical nature of this officer. He was dressed in a short-sleeved police uniform. He was muscular, perhaps ex-military, white, young, but somewhat experienced. It would be unfair to say there was a conversation between us. He just listened to me. Apart from him asking me some general questions at the beginning, the remainder of the conversation was me talking about the girl and how I didn't think there should be a police presence outside my home. When I tired from repeating the same, I took out my hand and the officer shook him. I then turned around to go to my home. He then quickly snapped at me, saying if I thought that I did everything according to the law. I said, yeah. He then proceeded to say that some of those emails could have been viewed as harassment under the state law. He followed me to the tip of the driveway, but he didn't continue on to it. I simply said that I didn't know. I was confused and harassed by the cop. I merely brushed this event to the side. Those words had a moral justification that appeared phony and hostile underneath. And why would a cop come all the way over to my home just to say that? It made no sense to me. Over the next few days, I was getting harassed by many different people. People who were always in the background seemed to be more interactive with me. The intrusive environment ultimately reached its peak with a car at the bottom of my street. This happened 2 full days after the cop left me with a threat. The street I lived on was a hilly dead end. The car was parked at the bottom of the street. It was a Sunday morning. After finishing an errand in the morning, I was returning home roughly at 9 to 10 a.m. I noticed a white Ford SUV with its hazards lights blinking. I drove past it and went on the street where I could have a side view of the vehicle. I was on the driver's left-hand side. There was a woman in the car. Windows rolled up, but the car was idling. She was sitting in a relaxed position, and I saw her talking into a device. The device looked bulky. Its geometry was similar to a mobile phone from the 1980s. After she said something into it and was about to place it down, she saw me viewing from a distance. She screamed something into the phone. I couldn't believe the fright in her motions. She was reporting on me to someone else. Why? She then proceeded to race off into the distance. I couldn't look in the same direction where she drove off, out of disbelief. I drove back home. I couldn't understand or believe what I saw. From what people have told me, this was an investigative car. But why were my movements deemed worthy for some bureaucrat to report on? To sit in an air-conditioned car on this warm Sunday morning. Days passed until I instigated the most important event of the story. I met with the cops in charge of the case. I went into the campus police station. I want to mention that the campus policemen are the state police. They're not a private security company. I spoke to the dispatcher. I told him that I was emailing a girl, but it turned out to be the police. We were both currently students at the university. I was getting harassed by many people who posed to be authority figures, and I wanted to speak with someone at the department immediately. My logic was that if I said something as absurd as what was happening to me, then it had to be written down and recorded. The dispatcher has to look into something as absurd as what I'm saying to be fact. If what I'm saying isn't fact, then it has to be on record. In a matter of minutes, he granted me permission to meet with the cops in charge of the case. Although the wait was well over 30 minutes, a cop and a partner appeared before my eyes. They wouldn't tell me anything about the case, but they did intimidate and humiliate me, playing dumb to the important question of what the case was and why I was meeting with them. Eventually a higher official came to the meeting and said that there was nothing they could do, that I hallucinated it all, and I should be drugged up just like they were. He left to be both incendiary and a bully, but other than being provocative and desiring violent confrontation, with a smile on his face, he was only a jaded desk jockey, covering up for his masters. As I left, I told them I would go back to the police station of the officers that left me with the threat. I initially went to that station a few days prior to this meeting but left empty-handed. But when I arrived there that day, I met with a dispatcher. Waiting a few minutes paid off, as I got the name of the cop on paper. So this piece of paper confirmed that the cop didn't act accordingly for the girl, but for someone else. When they get wronged by the authorities, they expect to be hostile, but when you interact with them in a kind and gentle manner, they basically collapse and don't know what to do. The police department basically admitted that they knew of the cop that came to my residence and there was a purpose to this visit. This purpose is open up to your speculation. Before we leave this topic, let's examine the cop's actions on my father's property a little bit closer. He left his jurisdiction and entered a foreign town. He entered my father's property without warrant, and he talked and listened to me for over 10 minutes but to leave me with a morally justified threat, while my father was in the background. I've never had a cop come over to my residence, casually. I think most citizens wish they saw this type of response to real crimes. Who benefited to his presence? I can tell you that the girl didn't. If you knew the cyber harassment laws so well, then why do you know the most basic laws that policemen don't have jurisdiction in foreign towns and cannot freely harass law-abiding citizens? So who were these terrorists in addition to your humble narrator? In reality, these threats to national security were bigger threats themselves than anyone else. I'll explore the four closest people I knew. You'll see some basic criteria for being called a terrorist, but you'll see much more when our backgrounds are mined by professionals. Potato Salad was my only sibling, some 15 years older than me and lived with my parents. His main characteristics are lazy, cynical, jaded, passive-aggressive, and hungry. He loved to be controversial in speech, so he would joke and talk about a lot of taboo topics in public. The effect was similar to eating potato chip in an opera house. Not everyone knew why the potato salad was noisy. Some even cried obscenity in the face of ignorance. He wanted to appear unique and educated among a populace that didn't appreciate either qualities. Potato Salad had a large collection of books, movies, and music. He liked to collect things rather than read and absorb them, something he must have learned in college. Some of these items can be termed as controversial, but they do not impede the law since they aren't illegal to own. He loved hoarding books from libraries, finding the most obscure texts and copying them into PDF formats. His internet history of viewing news websites might seem right-wing, but the only crime in viewing right-wing extremist websites, as the authorities term it, are thoughts, not actions. He's involved in the political system. He's on the lower side of the food chain. Although he likes to be called a potato salad, he is in reality some crackers and chips mixed together. His wanting to be called a potato salad cannot be understood or comprehended. Perhaps the image of a potato salad is more masculine and fascinating than his real nature. Half beast, half robot, there is only one known Robeast in existence. Robeast was Potato Salad's close acquaintance for well over 10 years. Robeast is less qualified than Potato Salad, having never finished a college degree but called the library his home for a number of years. Robeast is intelligent, but halted by the environment. In another dimension he would have been a mercenary or a computer. Although his name inflicts horror in the mind to hear of him, physically people crumble before his presence. For their protection, he is encased in a box of his own. There is a hole where the world can interact with him. Isolated and alone in a safe world, he is but a threat to himself. On some days, when you interact with him, he might surprise you with a vocabulary of 10 words. But he's usually mute and in the background. Any words of wisdom today, Robeast?
Friends are God's way of apologizing for your family. You cannot be lonely if you like the person you're alone with. Conflict cannot survive without your participation.
Think your life is bad? Meet the teddy bear who's been through more hands than your favorite limousine liberal. In a corner of your room, he will sulk and make sure that his wide smile of depravity is inflamed in your mind. Here are the only known facts about him. He survived on a kidney bean for over 2 months. He can imitate reading but not intelligence. He only blinks in November. Stares confuse him. He can point to the moon. He sees milk in black and white. He's exempt from taxes. He's never seen the end to a movie. He's got a problem with butter. He won the lottery without buying a ticket. He once had fingerprints but lost them in a bet. His favorite scent is Tuesday. He sings in Morse code, and he's even fathered a few virgin births. His life is one idle suffering over another. Bemoaned over counterfeit tea. Do you know pain? Suffering? Destitution? Well, meet the teddy bear who will trample you in the field of being wronged and self-pity. Poor Teddy. No one wants to wrap their arms around him anymore. I used to talk to him regularly, but his woes are now merely reverberated in the depth of his teacup, which some say he uses for more than tea. Teddy loves everyone, but no one loves Teddy. Watermelon was the most educated and oldest of the Terrace, over 2.5 times older than me. He lived in a fantasy world being a full-time peace activist, a pizza box enthusiast, a researcher, and was continuing his anti-establishment philosophy of now working for over 20 years. As I looked to him for guidance due to his involvement in the Green Party in spare time, he merely giggled at me. He betrayed me in many ways more than one, but time told me why. Before he was a small watermelon. We can all agree that it looks green on the outside, right? Green is one of the most restful of colors. It symbolizes self-respect, well-being, growth, safety, nature, and life. But it's an illusion toward his real nature. If we dissect him, a new color emerges, doesn't it? He may be green on the outside, but he hides the red on the inside. This red doesn't resemble passion, rather resembles negative qualities like being obstinate, resentful, intolerant, and even violent. He taught me a valuable lesson on those who preach the green philosophy. It's about feeling good and not progressing for good. I was the only terrorist that didn't escape reality. The only one that was ambitious and easily the most mature. I was the youngest by 15 years. I knew all of these terrorists, some more intimately than others. They were in the background for me and didn't resemble people I wanted to become, only people that were unique to pass some time with. They were different and entertaining compared to the environment that surrounded us. They were safe for me. I didn't have to worry about them betraying or competing with me for a can of sardines, and I could be honest with them, as opposed to so-called normal people. They weren't phony, shallow, hate-driven, manipulative, or opportunists. Most of them had unique and diverse backgrounds compared to mine and showed me a different world. It's important before I dissect myself to note that I wasn't only a terrorist in the eyes of the authorities. I was also a sociopath, and people love to throw that term in front of my face even though they didn't know the definition to one. But truth isn't important among these faces. It's only important that they feel good and important at the end of the day. If you're a nonconformist, independent of the environment, and Catholic, that's the basic criteria for a terrorist and a sociopath. I will nitpick these words because I think their existence has been modified to control people and not to inform them. I think sociopaths and terrorists do exist. It's just that bureaucrats have influenced the meanings of these words for their own political agenda. They've generalized the meaning to include over half of the population. So let's go to know me a little bit. My hobbies in 2012 and before was something like this. I was a computer program and I was into understanding electronic devices. I enjoyed creating music, then I was learning classical guitar. I enjoyed reading books. Then that hobby declined since high school. Some of my favorite books are written by Byron, Goethe, Tolstoy, Samuel Johnson. I enjoyed exploring certain musical genres, these ranging from Renaissance to modern day pop. Some of these were Ennio Morricone, Telemann, Brian Eno, Elvis, Morrissey, Gesualdo, Mendelssohn. I love films. I also enjoy the musings of the film critic. Some of my favorite directors were Francois Truffaut, Werner Herzog, Billy Wilder, Dennis Seckler, Woody Allen, Tommy Wiseau, D.W. Griffith. I did play video games. Yes, these included violent video games. I used to record a lot of video of my surroundings. I had a simple high-definition camera that I would carry around with me. I would test out filming techniques and try to capture moments. I was planning a film with Woe Is Me, though I was more dedicated than him. I was hoping to get it started in the fall of 2013. It would be a long-term project. I was certainly athletic. I was a very good soccer player, but that was more of an independent hobby that receded with the years. I loved hiking nearby trails, sometimes even industrial ruins. Pretty sure I left out a few hobbies, but you get the general idea. My personality was built on living a life close to my home. My parents also shared the same belief that the outside world was dull and pretentious, filled with more harming than good. I was introspective and authentic. That wasn't something that was promoted in my surroundings. I didn't challenge my surroundings, nor did I draw attention from it. I coexisted with it peacefully. I just wanted to focus on my life. I was celibate. I never drank or smoked or did drugs. I respected my body. Friendships were foreign to me as I desired qualities that were extinct in my population. Regardless, people usually mistake popularity for friendship. Relationships based on vanity and competition instead of trust and respect. Most people don't have friends. Rather, they have competitors. I went to university hoping to get a bachelor's degree in computer science and move out of the state. In the meantime, I was working on a lot of separate and unique skills. Some I was more detached from since my youth. I went more regularly at church in 2012 when I discovered the Tridentine Mass in my area. It was how the Catholic Mass was said before Vatican II, and said in its original language of Latin. I was a Ron Paul supporter then, but I was originally a Democrat who voted for Obama in 2008. I was still registered as a Democrat when I got entrapped. I was involved in local politics since grade school, but I distanced from it when I entered college due to the obvious corruption inside of it and the lack of positive progress. I had no criminal background. I didn't own any guns. I rarely watched TV. I didn't support the idea of murdering infants. I never attended any political rallies or protests. I wasn't an active member on any internet forum. I gathered my news regularly from Drudge Report, RT, Democracy Now! If I was in my car, or anyone's car, I would tune into Rush Limbaugh, Michael Savage. I tried to read the New York Times that they had at school. I had a regular subscription to the Wall Street Journal. I had a lot of magazines ranging from the New Yorker to America. A girl. You may ask a justified question. How are you certain that the girl just didn't want anything with me and I manufactured all this up? There was a simple character differentiation that solves this crisis. I searched for truth and meaning while she yearned for pleasure and control. This will be more easily seen in the emails and many other things. I saw her as vulnerable and alienated in that environment, unaware of that truth but desperate to conform and be accepted. Her love of literature and her rebellious nature were only a facade. All that burned inside of her was a desire of love, but stripped to an act. Physically, I found a certain charm to her, but I admit that I had a hard time taking her seriously. She didn't possess the characteristics of a lover that I desired. I was hoping for a platonic relationship, whereas she wanted a more physical one. There was an emptiness I felt when I was around her, but ultimately she would be my true love. I think there were some good qualities in her, but they were discarded or glanced over since people didn't notice or care about her in such ways. She was accepted and relevant only for her display vices. I sensed that her environment, from an early age, turned her into a person she wasn't all too proud of. I sensed a certain tiredness, a certain disappointment, and a disillusionment with life. A familiar song to me, but she didn't want conversation, but stimulation from me. What you've heard isn't necessarily a recipe for disaster. What turned it into a disaster was how she yearned for control. She was also desperate to fornicate. I couldn't either plainly communicate to her. I would have to throw myself into some fantasy role she created for me, and she wanted to be treated like a princess or a seductress, but neither applied to her. I just felt insecure and I wasn't into the entire idea of cheapening sex and calling it a regular pleasure. Being in love with sex wasn't what I wanted. Call me old-fashioned, but spreading your legs shouldn't be as easy as spreading butter. It's not a skill or an achievement. Just like bottled wine, the longer you wait, the better it gets. And trust me, my experience with love, as I was alone and away from her, was one of the best and greatest experiences of my life. My soul was on fire and I felt so much positive energy come into my life. All the control and independence I wanted in my life was quickly being threatened by the same source I didn't want to admit I was in love with. I felt so disheartened to just be a rubber for her. I sensed a lack of emotional capacity for love with her. I sensed a physical capacity, but it was disillusioned and a lie. It wasn't about caring for the other individual, but controlling the other. She would display these unbelievable lustful displays before my eyes, being titillated by my voice, and some even more absurd. Some men would call these fascinating qualities, but they weren't. They were almost manufactured and desperate. I think she was on heavy pharmaceuticals or antidepressants due to her lack of inhibition. I knew she had emotional baggage, but I was willing to be a good friend and boost her self-esteem. Because ultimately us meeting each other should have been more than a sensual relationship like she wanted. It should have been a spiritual relationship. I noticed that she wanted to play a submissive role with me. She wanted to be dominated and have someone tell her what to do. I wouldn't have any pride in myself if I treated her so cheaply. But I also sensed that such a characteristic of being weak was a facade. It was a trap for what she ultimately wanted, which was to dominate me through different dependencies, very predatory in her nature. Perhaps she just didn't trust herself. Perhaps it was a reflection on her own environment onto herself, and she needed this artificial security net. I had a hard time trusting or caring for her once I knew her name. I wasn't into artificial or token relationships. She quickly represented the modern form of being feminine, which was surprisingly masculine, very unattractive, and dull. There were times when I couldn't differentiate her from a man. I was disillusioned with love. With her, I didn't want these feelings for her. I hated how empty my future felt when I imagined myself around her. I felt disappointed by true love. I fell in love with her soul, but that was the part of her that she numbed with drugs and other vices. She wasn't a seductress, but I loved that clumsy and very ambitious desire to be called one. She was merely directionless and desiring the warmth and arms of love, not the emotional collection. Love was an end and not a means. I don't think she was a bad person. She just gave in to vices too easily, and that was all there was to her at that stage in life. She fitted criteria for a possessive masochist. As Wikipedia states, she bewitches and ensnares by becoming jealous, overprotective, and indispensable. Entraps, takes control, conquers, enslaves, and dominates others by being sacrificial to a fault. Controlled by obligatory dependence. She came out of a materialistic environment. But at the core I knew there was some good and promise in her. That characteristic inside of her, which she disguised from the world. That was the girl I fell in love with. She wore many faces, and the face I fell in love with was her natural face. The real her. The one that the world rejected and tossed aside. I certainly wasn't ashamed of it. We shared 2 teachers together. One of these was a philosophy teacher, who was an old man with little to no motivation. In that class we struggled to complete half of the outlined syllabus. Lack of organization and discipline were to blame. From the first class, throughout the semester, he had a few sayings that seemed like he wanted to be noticed. They were that he worked in intelligence and he studied terrorist groups. Memory serves that he stated this during our first class and repeatedly stated this throughout the semester. Usually before or during a pause in class. I never directed those things at me during the semester. Why would I? I thought he was lonely and wanted to be noticed among the students, to be admired and relevant. But he fit the character profile of being insecure and desperate enough to be noticed in the world. Sadistic enough to be somehow involved in his stupid entrapment episode. Paul Krugman, Richard Dawkins, and Thomas Friedman were his most alluded to characters in his class, apart from himself. I discounted him as a kook, but I respected his position as instructor. I think he felt lonely and irrelevant, similar to a condom worn after 30 seconds. Did this professional betrayal hurt and surprise me? Of course it did. But if he didn't believe in himself, then he didn't believe in anything. He had to put himself over another individual. Without his ego and false sense of worth, he was nothing more than a part-time state employee. He wanted to be remembered as a counter-terrorist mastermind, to have meaning and purpose in society, as opposed to what he was in reality. He had a job in an industry that was manufactured, whose only aim was to scare the public into them submitting all their liberties for a meager amount of safety. We two lovers only spoke to each other indirectly during class. She would make sure to smile at me during or before class. I felt intimidated and afraid to lose my independence. I could hear her uttering the word child in class and how she wanted one to her friend. I didn't live through 20 years just to get enslaved in economic, social, and educational mediocrity. I didn't want to sugarcoat reality. I didn't believe in relationships built on pleasure. Anyway, relationships with a person who lacks inhibition usually end messy unless you control that individual. I didn't want to control or replicate something I didn't believe in. The fact that she was older than me, and how she yearned for juvenile games between the sexes, meant that she could hurt herself and me easily. So I preferred the distance of emails. My essay was purely accidental how the relationship switched to email only. One of my reasons was due to the security and safety of them. I hated how I could touch her and how easily she would surrender to me. I hated this dynamic of having power over her. I sensed that she wanted to be a provider of a trustworthy friend, and she wouldn't compromise. She needed someone to control her, to be accepted and complimented on. The emails from her, which were actually composed by the police, confirmed by many people, were hollow, with an occasional fact dispelled falsely in an aura of importance. My emails were everything and nothing. I admit that as the relationship turned toward the unexpected, I did some unexpected things in them. They were distractions from time, but I tried to make them as comedic and unique as I could. I wanted to help her if I got involved in her life. I felt that she was capable of more and educated enough to accept these truths and accomplish much more in life. She certainly wasn't dumb, maybe impulsive. But we all have weaknesses that criminals within the law can exploit. There were 2 sightings of her after the semester ended, and during the case. At a mall and at a cinema. While going down an escalator in the mall in May, I saw her going up the opposite escalator. She had the most perversive stares directed at my friend. Perhaps it was meant to show that I was losing her. But this idea of possession was opposite to what I wanted for the both of us. Perhaps it was also to mock me for potentially preferring the company of a male over her. The next meeting was in a showing of a film called Moonrise Kingdom at a cinema. I said in my emails that I would go to the cinema and catch it and ask if she was interested in a whimsical manner. I got no response, so I went to it regardless. I had high expectations and I wanted to see the film. Wes Anderson films always impressed me. Moonrise Kingdom turned out to be my favorite as a film. The film paralleled our characters and environments so much. She showed up with a boy by her side. She sat in front of me. She also cheapened her appearance by dyeing her hair. I only recognized her through the shape of her nose and her fear of sitting down. She appeared weak and desired to be heard. Initially she was reckless with a nervous smile on her face, a phony confidence and joy that was overwhelming but quickly receded due to reality. I only acknowledged her with a brief stare, with an anticipation for the opening of the movie. The boy instantly sat down while she hesitated. I was shocked and confused for a few reasons. The effort of coming out to the cinema, no interaction or emotions displayed between her and the boy, her lack of interaction and uneasiness during the showing, and the initial seeing of herself in the light of fear. How did I feel? Bored, threatened, and humiliated by her, but entertained and inspired by the movie. She was quickly showing her true face. The desire to be hurt was apparent to my eye. if she wasn't desired as a seductress. I knew she was very distant to the person portrayed in the emails. I sensed a possible amount of harm after this incident due to her displaying the motioning of a sheep laying down before wolves to be ravaged. She wanted to become a victim of this event. This meant I was more ashamed to admit the truth to myself and her. I was more in love with that part of her that she suffocated and drugged up, and I felt I couldn't save that portion of her anymore. The moral justification behind the players at the institution was that if I was normal, then nothing bad would happen to me. What these players termed as normal was fornication and seeing each other merely as sexual objects. What my emails focused on were conversation and acknowledging our lonely existence in a world that didn't listen. I didn't discount her as flesh, but if I came onto her doorstep with some rubbers, I wouldn't have suffered. Ultimately, what was considered normal was to have no self-respect or self-discipline, to lay with anything that you said you loved, to do anything regardless of how harmful it was to another being because it just felt good. It wasn't to know yourself. It was only important that you knew what made you feel good. This philosophy, dark and overwhelming, shows that the modern day education system is nothing more than an indoctrination center. Who and why are they propagating for? There were several methods of fear on display during and when I became aware of entrapment. I'll briefly explain the three types of damages: objects, environmental, and human. Physical manipulation and destruction was something that turned out to be very common, but unnoticed unless you had a close eye. I obtained items at the school library that I never ordered. Sometimes things would be put in these books or oddly written on them. One Amazon book order came in entirely highlighted in red ink. Some items were damaged. Any musical equipment I bought during that time came in damaged. The initial long email from the girl vanished from my email account. All the rest of the emails stayed intact physically. The most important malevolence, since I usually never bought items or paid for services, was on my relatively new car. It had several manipulations occur to it while I was under the impression of obtaining an oil change. I went to the dealership where I bought it from in hopes of getting the oil change, thinking that the warranty would be good under it. I gave the keys to the office employee. I waited some 20 minutes before I was told that I would have to pay for it. I said I wasn't interested then and took the keys from them. The car remained in that same parked spot. When I came to the car, I noticed I couldn't open it with my remote. I had to open it manually. When entrapment became apparent to me, I examined the car more closely. I noticed a few CDs misplaced in certain places, the car manual roughened up, among other things. The most important anomaly was that my car didn't have traction control when I turned on my exterior lights. That's right. Someone came into my car and made sure not to only damage a few items, but also play around with the car's computer. They also put a service number tag on my rear view mirror, even though I didn't accept any service. Environmental was the biggest and hardest to document because it involved people. And the stock of people I lived with, except for some of the working and middle class, are dead on the inside. It was a summertime event for the sadistic and opportunistic in the area, which included a huge sum of the populace. Another word for this would be a spectacle, something had to be seen to truly believe it. This type of harassment was psychological, physical, and tried to destroy you emotionally. It was also conditioned onto the individual with time. It was degradation to a new degree, with a moral justification that was ludicrous. The only harm it could do to you was physical violence. There could be physical threats, but no one could come up to me and punch me. But as it was being played out, you didn't know the rules of this type of harassment. The idea behind the spectacle was something similar to 2 + 2 = 5. It didn't need a logic, with the exception that it was there. It was hurting me, and I wanted it to stop. The drive behind such a force isn't a positive one. People who harass you so you strike back at them, with a force equal to what they're doing collectively, not individually. This force would follow me the most vividly through late July to September, until the election season ended. After that, I was irrelevant. It was in the background before the cops visited. You had to know what was going on to notice it. The area I live in, it's hard to distinguish between hate and premeditated hostility. But once I let the authorities know, so many faces came into my life. The hate they preached couldn't be fathomed. It was excessive and I couldn't turn to anyone for safety. I had to rely on myself. I tried to find courageous people to help me, but they were a needle in a haystack. Here are some bare-bone examples of the spectacle. Dangerous driving, people would brake unexpectedly or try to cut you off. You could usually see a smile in their rearview mirror. That smile confirmed that it wasn't random or premeditated. People would say things that I wrote in my emails to the girl or in private Facebook conversation to me in public. People would try to antagonize me by vocalizing hostile statements directed at me, being physically intimidated or harassed by strangers, being followed or oddly stared at. Police would follow you, try to act macho, park next to your car, among other things. Physical and environmental damages being blamed on me. I was promoting crime. This was brainwashing. They tried to guilt me through psychological tactics, which was effective. There would be always something new happening behind it. Eventually, they would harass you to the point where you didn't know who you were. I couldn't rebel due to the exhaustion. There were dozens of incidents like this, but it played off of my illness with PTSD. There are a lot of people that benefit from me from fulfilling the mainstream narrative. The so-called outsider hate-driven against the world cliché is one of the most popular themes in dinosaur media. The authorities didn't want to know if I was a threat. They used all the force they could without physically hurting me to make me into a threat. I felt like Charlton Heston in the Omega Man. I was the only real man alive surrounded by a cult of plague victims that were deformed and nocturnal. This plague took normal people and created creatures that were sensitive to light and homicidally psychotic. I posed no threat to them, but they came from my blood. I do not know what I represented to them, but I do know that what I represented was something they feared and hated. There were a lot of things with the spectacle that I didn't mention. Some are quite fascinating, but time will showcase them. I may say it in a dull tempo, but portions of it will make you question reality. I found these two quotes from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World Revisited hit the logic of such a spectacle in the eyes of the authorities. The first one goes, Ivan Pavlov observed that, when subjected to prolonged physical or psychic stress, laboratory animals exhibit all the symptoms of a nervous breakdown. Refusing to cope any longer with the intolerable situation, their brains go on strike, so to speak. In order to stop working altogether, the dog loses consciousness, or else resort to slowdowns and sabotage. The dog behaves unrealistically, or develops the kind of physical symptoms which, in a human being, we would call hysterical. Some animals are more resistant to stress than others. Dogs possessing what Pavlov created a strong excitatory constitution break down much more quickly than dogs of a merely lively, as opposed to a choleric or agitated temperament. Similarly, weak inhibitory dogs reach the end of their tether much sooner than do calm, imperturbable dogs. But even the most stoical dog is unable to resist indefinitely. If the stress to which he is subjected is sufficiently intense or sufficiently prolonged, he will end by breaking down as abjectly and as completely as the weakest of his kind. The second quote follows. Psychological stresses can be produced in many ways. Dogs become disturbed when stimuli are unusually strong, when the interval between the stimulus and the customary response is unduly prolonged, and the animal is left in a state of suspense. When the brain is confused by stimuli that run counter to what the dog has learned to expect, when stimuli make no sense within the victim's established frame of reference. Furthermore, it has been found that the deliberate induction of fear, rage, or anxiety markedly heightens the dog's suggestibility. If these emotions are kept at a high pitch of intensity for a long enough time, the brain goes on strike. When this happens, new behavior patterns may be instilled with the greatest of ease. The only person in terror cell who suffered was me, mostly because I was the background the authorities needed for their propaganda. I was diagnosed by my doctor to have PTSD in August of 2012. I took antidepressants per his direction. I never took them regularly before, and in a few weeks major depression was introduced in my life. The initial shock from late July to August wouldn't recede, and the symptoms of PTSD would increment only with time, all while being in love with the same source that willingly did this to me. When I initially found out that the FBI was harassing me, I was shocked because I knew I was dealing with professionals who had the upper hand. After some initial harassment, my hands, when stretched against gravity, would shake and I would have intense headaches. My eyes were bloodshot constantly from stress, and I had some loss of my senses, including hearing. It was a fight or flight response every day in my home environment. This was a complete 180-degree change overnight on how violent and hostile people were to me, from a safe to a dangerous environment almost instantly. Eventually these headaches would come into my life. PTSD devastated me. While I was suffering from traumatic events, I was in a state of constant fear and trauma. There wasn't one or two events that traumatized me. There were dozens. And I didn't know why I was suffering, except that people wanted me to fulfill their propaganda, for them to control me and label me. Eventually, my brain became exhausted with the introduction of antidepressants. I couldn't rebel. I couldn't trust my body anymore. I could only witness the smile behind these hate mongers as they saw me defeated. I was just a piece of torn cloth with the antidepressants. If anyone would harass me, I would almost be willing to resort to hostile force. It was hard to contain these chaotic forces inside of me. It was a conquest to not harm any of the people who wanted to be hurt by me. I was living in a constant state of fear, and an unreality that needed my blood for their propaganda and purpose in life. The authorities termed my suffering as a hallucination, but it was psychological warfare, and it was more lethal than physical harassment. To be whipped, cut to pieces, or have any barbaric done unto me would have been much better than what the authorities were doing to me. I remember during those acts when I was suffering alone. At least you could fight back and call them scum. People could see your physical wounds and not doubt you. I couldn't protest to these lunatics with this psychological form of torture. If I did, I would easily get a felony record. Emotionally, I was devastated because they used a vulnerable and low-esteem girl. Although I was in love with her and I held her in a different respect apart from the flesh. I hated how the sadists within the law used the weak to fulfill their own needs. A naive girl did the devil's bidding. Most men would hurt this type of girl for being dumb, but I didn't. I was tired of hearing these stories long before entrapment. I didn't feel like venting this negative energy and hurting human life. No, she was only a tool, similar to a gun. Although I was wounded through her actions, she didn't pull the trigger. She was only a tool for the authoritarians. On top of that, I was tired of reading how the police used both sexes for their gain. I wanted to expose it, but she also wanted to become a victim. When I saw her at the cinema, I knew there was some perverse justification in her actions. She had her own narrative to fill. Society places victimhood with more emphasis and awareness than ingenuity. She wanted her 15 minutes of fame. She didn't get it. She can only become a bureaucrat now and not the victim. There is some cruel poetic justice with that fact. Eventually I was harassed to the point where I became isolated from the world. Sure, certain people waved my flag, but they didn't come to my aid. Many people have things to hide, and bureaucrats love to seek revenge. This is a common tactic with the IRS. Throughout entrapment, I didn't even know why I was being harassed. I knew that I was suffering and alone. I couldn't do it alone. I had PTSD, a fight or flight response, and major depression. They may be summarized by the medical institutions to be a checklist, but that's far from the truth. Combined together and being harassed non-stop by a mob makes it pure hell. I was merely a pulse in September of 2012. Onwards was a struggle to survive. In December of 2012, I would scream from the pain my brain was in for an hour on a few occasions. I would kneel on the floor, hand into a pillow, and scream at the loudest I could. I like to say that I screamed to the same pitch my brain screamed. Perhaps it was the memories torturing me. I was denied a life drive and left with a death drive as I struggled with major depression. As I was interacting with the world more in January to May of 2013, I noticed that I barely had any short-term memory. It took me a long time to regain it. Mentally, I was nothing short of a child. The only things that ran through my mind were the events of trauma. I had no past or future, just these traumatic memories, my mind exhausted. All that I learned in my life was for vain. Sure, those skills helped me survive FBI entrapment with the shadow government, but those skills couldn't be used to create anymore. I can't tell you how many days I cried, how I would huddle to a bedroom and listen to Arvo Part in the background, or how I would watch Strojcik or Edvard Munch and how I felt like these characters. How I felt trapped and alone in an insensitive and insane world. If I wouldn't engulf myself in these arts, then I would just cry. In silence I would stare to the ceiling and tears would flow down my face. Images during entrapment would suffocate me, or no thoughts at all on a rare occasion. I learned to love not thinking, to just see a white wall with no history to it. No trace that warmed life from the cold or shielded families from storms. It was simply there, just as I was there. We were both in the background with no meaning. Memories of being close to death, of the betrayal and lack of response, of the vanity that all I wanted to achieve. None of it was relevant. You have no idea how I just wanted to die. I couldn't believe how dark an abyss I was alone in during the winter and spring months. I don't have the energy to color it for you now. I was in the environment that produced all the trauma, and I was greatly reduced mentally, spiritually, and physically. I noticed I lost a significant portion of my IQ. My critical thinking skills were extinct for a good part until the winter of 2013. During some of this time I did manual labor with my father, hoping I would collapse from overworking and never come back to this world. I was lucky though. I had a family I could fall back on. If I was financially independent, I would have probably been on the streets or dead. All my skills diminished. I couldn't believe how easy it was to become something like I was. By December of 2012, I easily gained 40 or more pounds. My hair was falling out, receding. I've lost more hair now, with a balding spot on my top. I've easily gained some 60 to 80 pounds. Every day I would wake up to a predicament I couldn't understand, that enveloped me, which I didn't want to be part of. Major depression lifted, but by so much effort by my hands. But I would be battling through malaise in the summer and fall of 2013, while regenerating myself. I lived months on end in a downward spiral. Death, destruction, denial, and control were the only faces I would wake up to. How could someone who was degraded to the degree that I was rebel? And rebel for what? Just like Winston Smith in the end of 1984, I didn't care what the authorities told me 2 plus 2 was. I was cured. I, like Winston, I just wanted to die. Truth wasn't important anymore. I just didn't want to suffer anymore. I couldn't control reality. The authorities created reality. But the only way to rebel in my own way was to continue existence. Was to live and rebuild myself, and that was a very hard thing to surrender to. What I lived for wasn't to tell this truth to you. What I lived for was what inspired that flame of life in me when I was younger. Music, literature, film, paintings, God, good, love. Even though I couldn't create or understand anymore, I had memories of what I did. Those memories were my guiding light in the abyss. This is one of those stories where I, the protagonist, didn't have anyone to live for. I only had my dreams. Although tattered, destroyed, and humiliated, I could still call them mine. I could still dream compared to my surroundings. I was still unique and human. I've generalized my suffering, but it took a lot of personal effort to rebuild myself. This rebuilding phase took months and hundreds if not thousands of hours. I was a different person from the one in 2012. I experienced pretty much every human emotion. The unbearable lows I experienced. I could still go back to them for a few seconds, but thankfully I feel healed. I'm more optimistic and inspired to do something with my life now, even if it means I'm entirely alone by doing it. This clearly happened because of the moral decadence in my environment. Don't get me wrong, there was some good in my environment, but collectively it's empty and materialistic. I live in the proletariat city, but the state I live in isn't heavily segregated by counties. Rather, it is segregated by town lines. Whereas I live in a medium-income town, the town I border is one of the most prosperous and politically involved in the state. I rarely went to that town since it didn't appeal to me and I never posed a threat to this community. The political money from this town was responsible for this scenario. Might I say there's a huge political lobby that needed stories of so-called right-wing extremists and the danger they pose to society. This political force was so strong that they connected me to a corrupt politician who was being investigated with the FBI. Before I explore certain theories as to why this would happen, let me give a brief synopsis of the politician. The politician was one of the most powerful and dumbest in the state. He and his pals got caught doing the simplest of election fraud. It's almost impossible to get caught doing what they were doing. The FBI was starting to investigate them in 2012. They announced this publicly in the spring of 2012, but the politician continued his run for office. The story goes that he never got indicted, but a bunch of his closest pals did. He also lost the election. This was somehow insanely partially attributed to me. It appears that supposedly the FBI planted evidence on me associating to this case. Potato Salad and I were indirectly connected to this politician. The ties will be shown more clearly with time. This has been privately confirmed to me, and all I can attribute are a few theories as to why this happened. A higher number and certainty of people willing to harass me. The politician needs the evidence before the election date. It's time sensitive. Since the authorities have an agenda, they can't do it personally. They need henchmen willing to be exploited and patted on the head. More money and risk involved. More people to benefit and involve. More careers to be made and lost. Careers to be made in the FBI, local law enforcement, and a lot of anti-terrorism money and publicity. A young individual, inexperienced and naive against a conniving majority. Chances are he's going to retaliate in a short-term manner. Violence as the medium of expression. Outsider who doesn't conform. The sheep will see him as a threat. 4 legs are good, but 2 are bad. The mainstream generalization that people who don't believe everything that the governments and bureaucrats say are paranoid. Technocrats have termed independent thought as a mental illness. Creativity requires a lobotomy to these experts. Perhaps they thought that I would look into the evidence and become paranoid of the environment, since it was working against me. I've come across literature like this from the government when describing terrorists, especially right-wing terrorists. The roots of this come from a Cold War ideology that they believe in, where people plot against each other for the maximum benefit for the selfish individual. Another reason could have been just entertainment for the puppet masters. How the mob devours the innocent by potentially exposing the lack of morals the community follows. The realm of the impossible. How impossible for something this insane is likely to happen. I have nowhere to run because the courts, dinosaur media, and society work against me. Undoubtedly it was a test of my faith as I didn't have anyone to go or willing to help me. One of the most influential politicians in the state, the most powerful political lobby, the criminal class within the law, a liberal as against education system, and a bunch of indoctrinated sheep all come together for a common purpose: money and entertainment. They didn't expect the cars to get turned on them by one individual, and the minority of one was much more rewarding than being a majority of what they resemble, which was hate, vice, manipulation, lack of meaning, and degradation. I resemble the opposite, and I would rather live and suffer for a good cause than live in a lie that fed off of promoting individual selfishness and ego. One question shatters all. How can you expect justice out of a system that tortured you and tried to benefit over your demise? And who's responsible for this loss, this sorrow, this degradation? I can point to a few faces, but my mind knew dozens, if not hundreds of more. All foaming at the mouth, only wishing I could be a prophet to a message of destruction and manipulation. What is clear to me is that this cannot be pinned to a few opportunists. I do think they should be exposed and degraded to the same state that I was. I think everyone would love to see a bureaucrat squealing for mercy. But ultimately it's about the party ideology. These thoughts were conditioned in the vegetables that did ill against me, and there was a moral justification that reeked of insanity and complete consent. There was no independence of thought. It was either submission or destruction. And there was no other choice for me created by these authoritarians. I posed no threat to anyone. I never said anything insensitive to anyone. I never threatened anyone. If I did, trust me, I would be sitting in cuffs now and labeled as an FBI statistic. I could be termed as antisocial, but I really wasn't. I prefer the company of honest, decent, and hard-working people, not easily influenced and conditioned people. But it's not a crime to be shy. What were my crimes? They were as insane as not fornicating and thoughts. These thoughts had to be collected somehow. I speculate that surveillance techniques from the NSA were used on me. They created a personality out of my internet, library lending, and other personal histories. And they sold it to the highest bidder. They had to be researching me for some time because they knew how strict I lived my life to a code. They knew I would barely bend from it. I believed in perfection, and I didn't believe in shallow relationships. This wasn't planned overnight. They didn't harass any of the other terrorists in my cell because the authorities knew these people were disillusioned with progress. They gave up on life. The control freaks wanted to deny everything I could be, so I could protest in a similar fashion with what they were doing to me. They need violence. They need all that deserving hate within normal good people to be streamed into them. But we decent people mustn't. Before we go 2 feet forward, we must know how many legs they have. They may have the upper hand in that respect. The government needs crisis to be in power. Without crisis, why would you need a bigger and bigger government by each day? People will become independent and inspired. But when the government gets big, government produces the inspiration and safety for society. History also shows that a big government will not decrease. It will only expand and quickly abuse its power. Within an instant, people no longer have rights. They become statistics. In the last century, over 100 million people were murdered due to big governments and banks waging wars. My story exposes modern-day liberalism as a phony ideology it has morphed into. It's not about tolerance. It's about preaching hate while they rob us of our economic, religious, and constitutional rights. It's about replacing God with the state, because the state creates all. I witnessed the evils foreshadowed by the public concerning the Patriot Act. But who was my watchdog to protect me? No one came to my aid. The ACLU only threw their rear leg up into the air. And who would I sue? The authorities knew I barely had any money. My parents were hard-working laborers and they couldn't afford to send me to college. So I went to these counterfeit institutions hoping to get a certificate and educate myself in a spare time. The authoritarians also have the upper hand. They made and know the law, and they can easily exploit it for their own purpose. I didn't have the right to an attorney. I didn't even have the right to know what my own case was about. But they had all the right in the world to torture me. The pros outweighed the cons. Not only for the government, but especially for private interests. They could care less about me and the girl who sold me out for a few rupees. They had no care in the world if I would hurt the girl. They were probably hoping that things would escalate to that point for their own purposes. I hope the girl that sold me out gets a good job as a bureaucrat. There can be no other benefit in my eyes than a potential promotion into a bureaucracy. I fell in love with her so, but she didn't want love. She only wanted an illusion of power. Let her have that illusion of power as a bureaucrat. I will always love that portion of her that I fell in love with. I hope that she awakens one day. She stops popping those antidepressants and stops polluting her body with alcohol and cigarettes. She awakens out of her zombie-like state and realizes the lack of truth in her life. That she's just a cog in the machine. I beg her to never let her children suffer like she has, for her to educate them on the ills she has committed early on in her life and not to hide them. I hope she starts to read a book or look at a painting one day, out of curiosity. I know she's not a dumb creature. She can do some good in this wretched world, and I hope she does. As you see, there's still an optimism within me, even with all the senseless loss. Of all the people in this entrapment scenario, I do not want to expose the girl. I want no acts of revenge onto her, but the promise that she will grow into somebody I would respect. There is no reason to hate or spit upon the image of each other. We must come to accept that we were just used against each other by the older generations. She could have said that she did something dumb to me, but she didn't. She could have told me I was put in harm's way and that criminals within the law were about to hurt me, but she didn't. She only cared for her ego and illusion of power. Well, I hope you personalize your uniform with some glitter and perfume to hide the stench of tyranny. I've never seen anyone want to become a bureaucrat like you. You deserve that job. Hoorah! You are a good servant of the state. Maybe she can work within the system to take it down. Good luck with that idea. She chose between good and evil. Reap the seeds you've sown. Now about me. I lost everything. A good portion of my life, my past, my future, my health, my rights, my present, and much, much more. I still have loans to pay back for the semester I got entrapped with the FBI. I couldn't continue my education. Government intervention in my life has been proven for the worst. The government didn't save me or anyone, but at least I didn't become dependent on the government services. I was nothing more than an animal and I still work. These emotions of despair and destruction would eat me up on the inside. I hoped I would collapse on the job, but I made sure that I would continue despite all the pain I was in. I did often wonder what made me continue. Most individuals in my circumstance will look to death as the answer, but I didn't. I think that suffering is a part of life, not the end of all. And at the end of it all, it's all vanity. I bypassed hate very early in my suffering. You can hate someone, but it's worthless when that person isn't even aware of their own actions. They're nothing more than zombies. After you survived absolute hell like I have, well, you see life in a different perspective. Even though I was entirely degraded and barely able to be considered human, I knew that sense of loss and misery was what made me human. I lived through reality, and I knew the darkness that those who did harm against me lived in. Those who did ill against me, they had to live in their illusions because they couldn't accept reality. They can say that they didn't hurt me with a smile on their face, but as Blake says, the eye that alters all. And even though I would be screaming from pain due to the harassment done onto me several months after the fact, I could still say that I knew the true face of hell and survived it. I think a Morrissey lyric says it's the best. The song goes, "So how can anyone possibly think they know how I feel? Everybody look, see pain, and walk away. And as for you and your uniform, your smelly uniform, you think you can be rude to me because you wear a uniform, a smelly uniform, and so you think you can be rude to me. But even I, as sick as I am, I will never be you. Even I, as sick as I am, I would never be you. Even I, sickly depraved, a traveler to the grave, I would never be you. I would never be you. It's time to expose 1984 in the year 2014. What I've said is only a portion of the overall story. Please join the cause of liberty against tyranny. Thank you.